Reading 65. From the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Maurice, Nicoll, Volume 2. Birdlip, March 23, 1945. Commentary on the Food of Impressions. We live by impressions. Impressions are the most important food of all the foods that enter the human machine. We have 3 mouths on our faces: the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. It is necessary to reflect on this and think what it means. All these 3 foods give energy to the body, but the most important is the food of impressions. No matter what a depressed person eats with his mouth, or what air he breathes, it will not cure him until he gets that letter that he is waiting for, in which it is said that he has passed his examination, or that somebody loves him, or that he has won his lawsuit. Now, a letter is not air, nor physical food. It is a series of ink marks on a paper that convey to him certain meaning that transform his state. This is one of the things we have to understand about the food of impressions. For example, what you hear somebody say about you can depress or exalt you. Or again, when you see the number of the horse you have backed go up on the board, you will pass from depression to rejoicing. Now, do you think we live chiefly in a world of impressions and depend upon them? What you hear, what you read, what you see constitutes impressions, and also what we think to ourselves inwardly. Our real life is this world of impressions, and how we receive them, and how we react to them. And it is in this world of impressions that we have to learn to live in the right way. This very delicate world that we are continually concerned with and concerned about. A telegram may completely alter a sense of the future. A telegram is neither the food of air nor physical food, like a beefsteak, but it is a totally different kind of food which the work calls impressions. When a person smiles at you, it is an impression, and it may warm your heart and your whole being, whereas when a person frowns at you, the reverse result may be felt. Impressions are psychological, and yet the work says they have a certain materiality, a finer materiality than the materiality of air or a beefsteak. Now, I am taking the whole question of impressions from a certain angle, in connection with the idea that the work teaches, that impressions are the most important food of all. You must understand that this is a commentary on the food of impressions, and that I am speaking about the class of impressions that make it possible for us to exist normally. Being exposed to constant bad news, constant negative criticism by others, constant fault-finding, all these form a class of impressions that will not give us the right force for normal life. I mean under ordinary conditions of life. We all remember when someone has said something pleasant to us, and we must all have noticed how sometimes a single look or word can make us feel much better. In this delicate world of psychological impressions, we are like clumsy hippopotami, both to ourselves and to other people. For a long time we try to get impressions from others that will make us content with ourselves, having no strength to work against the wrong feelings of ourselves produced, for example, by flattery, by compliments, by successful moments, etc. When we are in that state, our psychic life is far too delicate and not rightly based. What is it we crave most, mechanically speaking? We crave most attention, and this belongs to the satisfaction of the vanity. This certainly gives a very powerful stimulus, so much so that if a person's psychological existence is based entirely on vanity, he or she will feel depressed if there is not a constant mention of him or her in the papers, and so on. To live by impressions of this kind is to live the life of this most powerful thing in us called false personality. To live the life of pure internal considering and of making accounts gives a very unsatisfactory basis to our existences, as it depends entirely on how people behave towards us, and this means we have no center of gravity in ourselves. so that strictly speaking, we do not exist except as functions of the praise or blame of other people. Adversity will hit us very hard, whereas success will raise us to an entirely wrong feeling of ourselves. We are then like dogs that depend so much on the praise or blame of their mistress or masters. And if a number of people meet together having these dogs in themselves, you may be quite sure that these dogs will begin to yap at one another. You will be in a room full of dogs, all yapping, all wishing to call attention to themselves, all jealous of each other. And I can assure you that this is the situation of the majority of people in life when they meet together in a so-called friendly party. Unfortunately, one or two of these people may have cats or tigers or bears on their laps, or even snakes, and in that case the friendly party will be extremely troublesome to anyone present who has any sensitiveness of the inner state of other people. Now, we should not allow the dog or the cat or the other animals to take in impressions and so determine our psychological existence. We should try to receive impressions more deeply than these animals can, these animals in us that we so carefully carry about. The question in the work is, on what do impressions fall in you? Do they fall on your dog that always demands attention and praise? Or on your cat that pretends to be affectionate or indifferent? Or on your snakes that hiss the whole time? It is for this reason that we are told in the work to watch where impressions go, on what eyes they fall, because all these animals are different eyes in us that are very undeveloped and are not really properly conscious to us yet, and belong, so to speak, to the not yet conscious side of us, to this other person in us that we do not notice yet, owing to our pretenses of ourselves, but which other people perhaps have noticed already. The object of self-observation is to make us more conscious of what is in us. Unfortunately, we move about in life imagining we know ourselves, and not realizing we have another side that has to be made conscious gradually before we can begin to grow. Living merely on the surface of ourselves, we can never penetrate more deeply into that background that prevents us from receiving influences of a finer order. Influences, in fact, that alone can begin to make us grow, because it is this dark, unconscious side of ourselves that stands between us and the influences of higher centers, the healing influences that come down from the side octave of the ray of creation. Unless we realize what fools we are, we will always imagine we are not fools, or if, for a moment, we feel we have been foolish, say socially speaking, we will at once heal the breach by a terrific discharge or exudation of self-justifying, so that we once more retain our curiously inadequate idea of ourselves, which we do not see as being inadequate, or indeed as being nothing but a kind of scarecrow that we imagine to be a perfect man, a perfect woman. When impressions begin to fall on us to a deeper level, we begin to live in an entirely new world. If you want to live in a new world, you must go deeper. You must get away from the surface world of yourself, and this is certainly in one sense painful, but in another sense extraordinarily full of meaning and new satisfaction. You then begin to realize what this means. I am not this I. And this already means a certain degree of self-remembering. Now the work teaches that we must have constant impressions in order to live. We must have the impressions of all foods, all the fruits of the earth, because we are a microcosmos, or small world, living first of all in the macrocosmos, or big world of nature, our first big world, the first cosmos above us, called in the work organic life. We are given the power, in the marvelous organization of our senses, to taste the impressions of this big world of nature. We are given the power of tasting butter and jam, and bread, and pears, and apples, and caviar, and fish and meat, and of smelling grass and the sea. Have you ever thought that we have these powers already in us? You taste a peach or a strawberry and think that the difference of taste lies in the two fruits. Do you not see that the difference lies in your power of tasting differently, and that you have the apparatus already made in you for taking in these two different impressions of taste? Think for a moment, because people find some difficulty in seeing what is meant here. And moreover, people find it difficult to see that we are a microcosmos, fitted into a macrocosmos and prepared for it. They find it difficult to understand that we are related to the whole cosmos in general by our construction. They find it difficult to see that we are born in a universe to which we can respond, and which responds to us if we find out the right request to make. One reason is because people take themselves as completely isolated, not seeing that they are constructed to live in the universe, and therefore must be a part of the universe, and so in some way correspondent to it. We have eyes that respond to the vibrations of light, ears that respond to the vibrations of air. In short, we are constructed to take in impressions. Now, let us confine ourselves to the first cosmos we live in, namely organic life, or the earth, without which we could not exist. It supplies us with food and air, with certain impressions. We are speaking at the moment of taste derived from the products of nature. All these are necessary for us because we have the apparatus ready. We have an extraordinarily fine apparatus of taste, smell, touch, and sight for appreciating what the earth produces. And this fine apparatus must be satisfied reasonably with the fresh products, so important for health, namely, those impressions that fall directly on the instinctive center. You will perhaps see the argument. The argument is that we have got in us the powers of tasting and smelling different things created by nature, and so producing different impressions. And since we have these powers in us, such as the power of distinguishing between the rich taste of a strawberry and the equally rich taste of a raspberry, therefore one side of our life of impressions must be satisfied by the products of nature, since we have born in us the necessary apparatus for receiving impressions from these different objects. I think this argument is understandable and belongs to the general argument in the work that we have more in us than we use. For this reason, you will see that all scientific attempts to make synthetic foods, powders, and so on, from which we can get no right impressions of taste, are entirely false and, in fact, not at all scientific. Since we are constructed to live first in organic life on the earth, as small living cells in this vast organism, we require to be nourished by it and not by any substitute for it. Now this constitutes our first, or instinctive, life of impressions. Food is an impression first of all, then a substance or physical food. The impression gives appetite, but the food substance gives nourishment. To try to replace synthetically the food substance without the impression of taste and the pleasure that results is to ignore the most important food, namely, impressions. I would like you to discuss this, as it is a very important idea to grasp. Ask yourselves why nature provides so many interesting tastes and smells in food. Also ask yourself why people become tired physically when they receive tasteless food for a long time, and what the difference between an appetizing and an unappetizing meal means in regard to exciting the right activities of instinctive center, the work of the stomach, etc. Now I want to bring in here in this connection what the work calls the supreme food of impressions. Let us suppose we are governed by tastes. We have heard about inner taste, which can discriminate between good psychological food and bad psychological food, just as our physical taste can in regard to literal food. The supreme physical impression that we can give our whole machine is that of self-remembering, the finest taste of all tastes possible, the taste of something akin to I. The work says that a moment of self-remembering supplies every cell in the body with food of a kind that it does not ordinarily get. The work says that when you remember yourself, you give a shock to the whole of you. Every cell receives force and new energy, a new food. This is called the first conscious shock, where all our work lies for many years, and this is always what we forget to give ourselves, although we have heard it 101 times. Instead of remembering ourselves, we insist on arguing with ourselves, or on thinking about everything, or even thinking about what self-remembering means. You have often heard that if you do not know what self-remembering means, you should try to stop your thoughts, even for a few seconds, to stop everything for a short while, and to be nothing, no one. If you can do this, you will notice that you feel quite different, as if you had turned on the light, or if you think this image too strong, as if you had suddenly noticed where you are, suddenly come to your senses, or as someone once said to me, it is as if I suddenly took my head out of the water. When such an experience is undergone, you may notice also that you suddenly see the room you are in, or the window seems to transmit more light, or you hear sounds more clearly, or you can read the paper without your glasses. This means that the cells in your body have been enlivened in some way, have been stimulated. They have received new food that springs out of this act of self-remembering. However, our self-hypnosis, our continual identification with our quite useless chains of thought, our powerful preoccupations, which we think so important, and of course never lead anywhere, our continual internal considering, our account-making, and the entire mass of our negative emotions make it very difficult for us eventually to attempt to self-remember. In the strain of life, we never remember ourselves. To do so, we must have some force coming not from life but from another direction to enable us to make the attempt. We have to step out of ourselves, out of the train and bus of mechanical life in order to do so. We have to step out of the finely interwoven and usually unpleasant pattern that we insist on thinking is our life. And we find no reason why we should, and perhaps have no idea what it means to step out of the stream of our daily life for a moment and attempt to expose ourselves to influences that come from an entirely different direction. Now I want you to think what it means when we nourish our machine by the wrong feeling of I, as we all do. We are told that if we could attain the right feeling of I, in self-remembering, every cell in the body would have new life. And so, by contrast, does not this teaching imply that when we identify with the wrong feeling of ourselves, we will be giving wrong force, wrong energy to the cells of the body? Can you understand that if we are very negative and evil-minded, we feel ourselves through such feelings, into which we put the feeling of I, so that we give our body very bad food from this highest source of food, which comes from our psychological state, from impressions coming from different I's that we are identified with, and not simply through impressions coming from the senses, which have their own importance and value, but are on another scale? I remember O saying once that we all have eyes that can make us ill when we identify with them, and so get under their power. It may be necessary, however, to meet these eyes and fight with them eventually, because sooner or later we have to fight everything in us that is against the work and the harmony it seeks to make in us, by the process of perception and inner separation, by seeing what is true and what is not true, what has good will and what has evil will to the work. I am intentionally leaving this paper unfinished, in that I have not drawn together the various aspects. The paper is a commentary on impressions, and as it stands, impressions coming through the senses are first spoken of, and then impressions coming from the feeling of I. The highest impression is the feeling of real I. This does not come from outside, but is an impression from inside. At the same time, all external impressions coming in change in their intensity according to what I you are in to receive them. If you are in some state of self-remembering, external impressions may be intensely beautiful, whereas if you are in negative eyes, the most wonderful meal or most beautiful day means nothing to you. When a thing means nothing to you, you get no impressions from it. The more a thing means to you, the more impressions you get, and vice versa. But all this is a question of long observation and interchange of views amongst you. But everyone should ask himself or herself, on what food of impressions do you nourish yourself? If you are negative internally, as a rule, you will take in unpleasant impressions and feed yourself on them. Or if you are depressed, you will take in only depressing things from the newspapers, and this will infect the whole of the human machine. Or if you are fearful, nervous, and so on, you will take in impressions accordingly. Usually, from the stream of our inner life, we get very small inner impressions, or as it were, stale impressions. However, if you make an effort, you decrease entropy and take in impressions. You must ask yourselves what entropy means. It means, in short, a state where everything becomes equalized, and there is no interchange of energy, and so everything is stale. When you make effort, you go against your staleness. For example, when you deny yourself something, you increase its attraction, and then your entropy is decreased. The idea of self-remembering is to decrease entropy enormously by having a very distinct sense between you yourself and external life. All identifying increases entropy, runs us down, so that there is no difference between us and life, as it were. If you can see life as an illusion in the right way, as yoga systems teach, you will feel an increasingly powerful difference of potential between you and life, and this will decrease entropy. But if you are immersed in life, everything will come into an equilibrium, and you will cease to take in impressions beyond the minimum necessary